I tell you a true crime story and we drink. The following content may be disturbing to some. Discretion is advised. If you choose to enjoy one of our themed margaritas, please ensure that you are of legal drinking age and have fun but drink responsibly. In the cold, early winter months of 1692, two young girls would begin the hysteria that would destroy families, leave children without mothers, and tear apart a community. Within the course of 15 months, in Salem Village, Massachusetts, at least 144 people would be arrested on charges of witchcraft, 54 confessions would be secured, and at the end of the chaos, 14 women and 5 men would be hanged. 4 people would die in prison, and 1 man would be crushed to death by rocks. The frenzy would reach far beyond Salem to more than 20 towns in the area, and for more than 300 years after. In a story with no winners, the question remains even today, what happened in Salem and why? Today's margarita is definitely more for looks than it is for drinks, and it's definitely in honor of our spooky month of the macabre here at Margs and Mayhem. We're going to make a classic margarita with 4 basic ingredients: tequila, triple sec, lime juice, and because I like my drinks sweeter, simple syrup. So we'll do 2 parts tequila, 1 part triple sec, 1 part lime juice, and a half a part of simple syrup. Then to that, we're going to add some drops of black food coloring. 1 or 2 should do just fine. If you're feeling fancy like I was, you can also add some drink glitter. I bought mine from Amazon. Also, I didn't even know they made black food coloring, and I know you can make your own by mixing some of the primary colors, but the black food coloring is chef's kiss. So we'll shake it up and then strain it, bougie strain, over fresh ice. I'm also using a black salt rim this week, so we've got a truly black magic margarita. All right, on to the witch hunt, literally. A Puritan in 17th century America was to be mostly scared. Scared of the indigenous population that lived near their American colonial towns. Scared of bad winters and bad summers and the unpredictable nature of life and death in that time period. And most of all, Puritans were scared of God. A Puritan's life was full of spiritual fear and dominated with a constant search for God's favor or wrath. This was a daily struggle for Puritans, especially Puritan women, as they actively attempted to stop the devil from overtaking their souls. Puritans held the belief that men and women were equal in the eyes of God, but not in the eyes of the devil. Women's souls were unprotected because their bodies were small and weak. Puritans also held the belief that any one person's deviation from the righteous path could condemn an entire community to collective wrath from God. It was a strong Puritan belief that the devil, upon overtaking humans, used them to do his bidding on earth. Those who worked for the devil were witches. What would come to pass in Salem was nothing new. Witchcraft and witches have been pursued and persecuted for centuries. The first major witch trials occurred in Switzerland in 1427. In the 16th and 17th centuries, between 40 and 50,000 people were executed for witchcraft in Europe alone. 80% of these people were women, by the way. Many of these trials were spurred on by the Malleus Maleficarum, a book which translates into The Hammer of Witches, written in 1486. It insisted, rather single-mindedly, that witches were the source of all evil in the world. This book, which was published in Latin originally, but then was translated into English, German, French, and Italian, and began to include illustrations like witches flying on broomsticks, performing the shameful kiss, which was literally when women would commit to Satan by kissing his ass. Literally, y'all. This book said that women had, quote, slippery tongues, and since they are weak, they find an easy and secret manner of vindicating themselves by witchcraft, end quote. Another assertion was that, quote, all witchcraft comes from carnal lust, which is in women insatiable, end quote. Rampant misogyny on a Thursday, my favorite. This book gave inquisitors not only the how-to of spotting witches, but the what to do with them. In England and New England, this translated to hanging. Not the kind of hanging that leads to a quickly broken neck, by the way, but the kind that leads to a slow strangulation while gawkers watch. In countries like Spain and Italy, burning people alive at the stake was the preferred method of witch cleansing. By the mid-17th century, however, witch trials had begun to decrease throughout Europe, for a number of reasons, including when the prominent members of the community began to be named, authorities tended to put a stop to the madness. But on the fringes of Europe and in American colonies, they continued. This brings us to Massachusetts. Today's story takes us just out of Salem town and into the smaller Salem village, because those colonial Puritans were just as creative as can be with their town namings. Samuel Parris was a Harvard dropout and a failed sugar merchant. He had moved his family, which included his wife Elizabeth, daughters Betty and Susanna, son Thomas, and orphaned niece Abigail Williams, as well as an enslaved couple, Tituba and John Indian, to Salem from Boston in 1689 to serve as the fourth minister for the community at Salem Village. Up to this point, there had been some rumblings within the community about whether or not they even needed a minister, because that meant more taxes, and many would have rather walked the 5 miles to Salem town just to avoid those taxes. Samuel had even given some fiery sermons related to his withheld paychecks. So let's just say the Parris family wasn't the most liked in the village. In February of 1692 in Salem Village, 9-year-old Betty and 11-year-old Abigail began to have fits, which a nearby minister declared were beyond the power of epilepsy or natural disease. They threw things around the room, made strange sounds, screamed, and contorted their bodies into strange positions. The girls complained of being pinched by invisible fingers and pricked with invisible pins. In this time period, when physical evidence of an illness or ailment could not be found, doctors would often assume that witchcraft was to blame. In fact, William Griggs, the only doctor in Salem, would declare that they were, quote, under an evil hand, end quote. Tituba would be named by Betty Parris and Abigail Williams as the source of their pain and affliction. This fits the typical witch hunt pattern of accusing an outsider. Tituba was an enslaved woman with dark skin. Her history isn't totally known, but it is likely she became enslaved in Samuel Parris's household while he was running the sugar plantation in Barbados. Having darker skin, like the greatly feared indigenous communities outside Salem, makes it no surprise that she was one of the first accused. Legend holds that she told the girls stories of enchantment about sexual encounters with demons and fortune-telling. It's possible the girls themselves spent time in the woods attempting to use fortune-telling to determine what boy was in their future. Who knows? Before too long, 2 other girls within the community began to suffer similar symptoms. Anne Putnam Jr., who was 12, and Betty Hubbard, who was 17, began to convulse, scream, and contort like the other girls. They would name Tituba again, and in addition would blame 2 other Salem women, Sarah Goode and Sarah Osborne, as their witch torturers. Sarah Osborne, 49 at the time, was an older woman within the community, another characteristic making her more likely to be accused. Also, interestingly, she was in a dispute with the Putnam family at the time. Sarah Goode was an old woman who was also poor, a characteristic of sloth within the Puritan belief system. Rumors had circulated the community for years about Sarah Goode, including that she had bewitched her neighbors and murdered their livestock. She had also, after being widowed, married a young man that at one time had been her indentured servant. An insult to Puritan ideals, no doubt. Another outsider, another easy target. All 3 women were brought before the local magistrates on the complaint of witchcraft. Starting on March 1st, 1692, they were interrogated for several days, when Tituba, somewhat surprisingly to our modern senses, spent 4 days enthralling the court audience with her confession, tales of witchery. And she also tells the court that there are many witches in Salem, including the 2 Sarahs, who had told her to attack Anne Putnam with a knife. She claims that a tall man who wore all black carried a book around with the names of 9 women, some from Boston and some from Salem Village, signed within its devilish pages. There is some speculation that Samuel Parris had beaten the confession out of her. Witchcraft within the home of the minister himself was a no-go, and it's possible, probable even, that he beat Tituba to assuage his own shame and resolve the issue quickly and as quietly as possible. It's also possible that Tituba believed that a confession might spare her life. Turns out she was right. Regardless, despite her confession and the Sarah's proclamations of innocence, all three were then sent to jail. The hysteria was reaching a fevered pitch. In March, others were accused of witchcraft. The first was Martha Corey. Martha was an upstanding member of the Salem Village Church and was known to be a pious woman. She had, however, been outspoken in declaring that the girls were faking and that none of this witch nonsense was real. In short order, she was accused by Ann Putnam and Mercy Lewis, a young servant girl in the Putnam household. Several times, in fact, between March 7th and 12th, when Anne was suffering a bout of tremors, she would name Martha as her tormentor. When Martha was put on trial, even her husband, Giles Corey, more on him later, would testify against her, saying he found it difficult to pray in her presence. Rebecca Nurse was the wife of Francis Nurse, with several children and grandchildren, and a well-respected member of the community. At 71 years old, Rebecca was one of the oldest accused. Upon hearing of the accusations, Rebecca said, quote, "I am innocent as the child unborn, but surely what sin hath God found out in me unrepentant of, that he should lay such an affliction on me in my old age?" These accusations terrified community members. If such upstanding members of the community could be witches, then anyone could be one, pious or not. Dorothy, or Dorcas, Goode, Sarah Goode's young daughter, who was only 4 years old, was interrogated and confessed to not only being a witch, but she also said she had seen her mother making deals with the devil. Ann Putnam Jr. and another afflicted girl, 17-year-old Mary Walcott, claimed the child bit them as if she were an animal. Dorothy would survive the 7 months she spent shackled and chained in prison. On April 3rd, Sarah Cloyce walked out of the Salem Village meeting house and let the door slam behind her. This act of defiance, I guess, was seen as an act of protest for her sister, Rebecca Nurse, who by now was in jail charged with witchcraft. Soon her name was on the lips of several of the girl accusers, including Abigail Parris and Mary Walcott. It was April 4th when Elizabeth Proctor was accused. I think you're starting to get the idea. In early March, the Proctor's servant, Mary Warren, began to have fits, but Elizabeth's husband, John, was dismissive of her and just made her work harder. He felt that witchcraft should be suspected of the bewitched girls themselves and not of the respectable women of the village. Less than a month later, his own wife would be in front of the magistrates. She would be tried and convicted, but would be spared the noose. Her husband would not be so lucky. Between April and May, an additional 19 people would be arrested and charged with witchcraft, including Giles Corey, husband to Martha. That's what you get for testifying against your own wife. I think it's difficult in a spoken word format to get the vibe of what was happening in Salem totally across. This is a time with no real science to speak of, and certainly not a time where things like mental health were considered. This Puritan-dominated society was just generally terrified. Magic, witches, and the devil were an inarguable reality. And all of a sudden, 10 teenage girls are barking at the dinner table. They're screaming that they're being stuck by invisible pins, and they're contorting their bodies wildly and hiding under the kitchen table. Parents, parishioners, and the community at large were terrified. The panic was out of control. Sarah Osborne, one of the first 3 women accused, would be the first victim, dying in prison on May 20th. She and 3 others, Lydia Dustin, Ann Foster, and Roger Toothaker, would die due to the atrocious witch prison conditions over the course of the summer and fall months of 1692. Bridget Bishop would be the first to hang. 60-year-old Bridget ran 2 taverns alongside her husband, Edward. Bridget had been accused by 5 of the girls: Abigail Williams, if you will remember, is Samuel Parris's niece; Ann Putnam Jr., who, by the way, herself was responsible for 62 accusations of witchcraft; Mercy Lewis, the Putnam servant, and 2 other girls that I'm not going to get into because this episode isn't 14 years long, Mary Walcott and Elizabeth Hubbard. Bridget Bishop's case was first brought to the grand jury, who endorsed all the indictments against her. Bridget wore black clothing and odd costumes, which was against the Puritan code. She was another outsider, someone who was different, yet another easy target. During the incredibly dramatic trial, anytime Bridget would look at one of the girls, they would be immediately struck down, and only her touch would revive them. Several of the adult townspeople also testified against Bridget, saying she bewitched them or their children. In court, they performed a humiliating examination of her naked body, finding what they determined to be a witch's mark in her genital area. The jury bought the allegations hook, line, and sinker. Bridget was taken to a wooded area known as Proctor's Ledge and was executed by hanging on June 10, 1692. There would be many more. Between June 29th and 30th, Sarah Goode, one of the original women, Susanna Martin, Elizabeth Howe, and Sarah Wilds would be tried for witchcraft, found guilty, and condemned. Rebecca Nurse, the well-respected, pious, church-going Salem Village community member, also had her trial the same day. Rebecca was not permitted to have a lawyer, as no one accused of witchcraft was allowed to have a lawyer, so the 71-year-old woman represented herself. Many people from the community testified on her behalf. Often, the afflicted girls would break into fits and claim Rebecca was tormenting them. In response, Rebecca said, quote, "I've got nobody to look to but God," end quote. In the end, the jury actually ruled Rebecca not guilty. Immediately upon the declaration, however, the girls' spasms began dramatically again. Due to a legal technicality in that day, the jury actually immediately requested a second chance of deliberation. A point had been made that Rebecca had made an offhand remark that another accused witch, Deliverance Hobbs, was, quote, of her company, end quote. If they were of the same company, it must mean they had both kissed the devil's ass, if you know what I mean. Rebecca, who was hard of hearing, did not hear the question. She later explained to her children that she was referring to this woman as a fellow accused witch. Her age and hearing was her fatal flaw. The jury changed their verdict and sentenced Rebecca Nurse to death. The governor of Massachusetts, Sir William Phips, at one point actually granted Rebecca a reprieve, but it was rescinded. On July 19, 1692, Rebecca would be hung at Proctor's Ledge alongside the 4 others tried on the same day as her. Her family would sneak over there after dark and retrieve her body, burying her on the family homestead. If you're wondering, this brings our body count to 6. Start drinking. We're less than halfway there. On August 19, 1692, John Proctor, George Jacobs Sr., George Burroughs, Martha Carrier, and John Willard were hung at Proctor's Ledge. All of them had in some form or fashion been accused of witchcraft by the young girls. George Burroughs, on the day of the execution, began to recite the Lord's Prayer as they put the noose around his neck. This shook the audience to the core, as they had been taught to believe by Cotton Mather, a renowned preacher and author, that witches were unable to recite the Lord's Prayer. Unlucky for George, Cotton happened to be there that day and convinced the crowd that sometimes the devil looked like an angel of light. By the way, Cotton Mather was a real racist, classist, misogynist piece of garbage. In an effort to save his elite lifestyle from uprisings from both poor white and black colonials, he wrote a book not only attempting to distract the poor citizens from the real enemy, the wealthy, and focusing them on an invisible one, witches, but let's not leave out the fact that nearly every instance of the devil figure that he wrote about attacking the pious white person was described as black. Cotton Mather didn't stop defending the Salem witch trials until the day he died. Giles Corey had been arrested in April, shortly after his wife, on suspicions of also being a witch. Evidently, witches that are male are not wizards in this case. We're not sure. Anyway, Giles, in an attempt to stop the ridiculous madness, simply decided to refuse to participate in this criminal process. He refused to answer the charges against him and refused to plead either guilty or not guilty. He instead chose to stand mute. As a result, the court ordered the placement of heavy stones on his chest. They gradually added more and more stones atop his body in order to compel him to plead. For 3 days he lay, alive, with the stones crushing his chest. It's believed that the only words he said were, "More weight," until he was crushed to death beneath the rocks. Martha Corey, remember the well-respected church member that thought the silly girls were lying? The one whose husband just died by rocks? Well, on September 22nd, 1692, having been convicted, she was hung. Alice Parker, Margaret Scott, Anne Pudiator, Mary Easty, Samuel Wardwell, Wilmot Red, and Mary Parker would join her at Proctor's Ledge. These would be the last hangings to take place during the Salem witch trials. What made it stop? Well, for one, it seems like not everyone in the area was swept into the witchy madness. During the trial of Rebecca Nurse, one of the girls shouted out the name of a prominent pastor in Boston, Samuel Willard. One of the magistrates announced firmly, "No, you must be mistaken," and sent her from the courtroom. It seems that the naming of prominent people in the community managed to make the legal authorities question the madness, making them at least partially to blame for not putting a stop to things sooner. Increase Mather, Cotton's father, yes, they did have some pretty creative names in the Mather family. Well, he seemed to have more of a conscience than his son, and wrote, quote, "It is better that 10 suspected witches should escape than 1 innocent person should be condemned." End quote. Indeed. By the end of October, the governor of Massachusetts had dissolved the investigations and released most of the prisoners. By May of 1693, everyone who had been accused of witchcraft was either pardoned by him or released from prison. The madness was over. So what do you think? What caused the girls to have these spasms, fits, contortions, barking? What was the reason for these teenagers to cause such incredible chaos in their small town? Is there a physical explanation or a mental health explanation? And what made the town itself so susceptible to this madness? What allowed them to be so caught up in the hysteria themselves that they were willing to try and convict their neighbors, their friends, on such little, if outright no, evidence? What about these downright medieval light trial methods? Can you imagine what things would be like if our justice system allowed things like juries to takesy-backsy a verdict immediately upon giving it? Wild times back then, I gotta say. The repercussions of the Salem witch trials lasted for centuries. Those who were lucky enough to be spared their lives were released from prison, often to economic and social ruin. In the 17th century, prisoners were charged for their food and lodging, even if found innocent, and they could not be released until their debts were paid. Tituba, the enslaved woman, remained in jail for nearly a year until an anonymous person paid her debts. Another victim here was Lydia Dustin, who died in prison in March of 1693, despite being acquitted in February, because she could not pay her prison debt. The whole village, in fact, struggled economically as a result of the trials. Farmers had been pulled into trial when they should have been planting crops. The Reverend Samuel Parris gave a few sorrowful sermons in which he admitted the devil might, quote, take the shape of the innocent, end quote. I guess that was his version of an apology for his daughter and niece starting the whole damn thing. Little too little, little too late, as by 1697 he and his daughter Betty were forced out of Salem Village for good. In 1709, 28-year-old Ann Putnam Jr. would apologize to the family of Rebecca Nurse and confess to her role in the murder of innocent people. She would say, quote, I desire to be humbled before God, that I, then being in my childhood, should, by such a providence of God, be made an instrument for the accusing of several people for grievous crimes, whereby their lives were taken away from them, whom now I have just grounds and good reason to believe they were innocent persons, and that it was a great delusion of Satan that deceived me in that sad time. End quote. She would be the only one of any of the girls to admit her role in the hysteria. Monetary reparations in the amount of about $5,000 each in today's money would be given to the families involved in the Salem witch trials. And in November 2001, the Massachusetts legislature passed an act exonerating all who had been convicted and naming each of the innocent. There have been many theories about what caused these 10 girls to cause such literal chaos in their small town. For the last 300 years, scientists, psychologists, and historians have examined and explained what they think led to the traumatizing trials and tragic deaths of so many innocent people. Immediately following the trials, the belief was that this was divine retribution, because of course that's what they thought. The people of Salem Village were full of sin, and therefore the community at large faced God's wrath. Many historians point to a perfect storm of the Puritan worldview in combination with the threat of justified violence from indigenous towards small colonial towns like Salem Village. They also cite the feuding within the town's residents and societal pressures placed on adolescent females within the Puritan church. There are also the factors of groupthink and the all-powerful power of suggestion, both of which are proposed psychological factors. In addition, let us not underestimate the power of gossip and the importance of reputation in colonial America. A story told and repeated oft became truth and had the power to destroy an entire life, both metaphorically and, in this case, physically. One researcher, you may have learned about, suggested in the 1970s that there was a possibility of something called ergot poisoning in Salem Village. Ergot is a fungus blight that forms hallucinogenic drugs in bread. It's the same kind of stuff that's in LSD. It thrives in a cold winter followed by a wet spring, which is what happened in 1692 Salem Village, Massachusetts. Ergot poisoning can cause violent muscle spasms and hallucinations. Most researchers, however, believe that what happened in Salem Village that fateful year was a combination of all the factors you can possibly think of, except probably for the bread, since the histrionics were only coming from a very small subset of the population that probably needed a little more positive reinforcement than they were currently getting in their life, but who knows. Salem Village was renamed Danvers in 1752. After centuries of hiding its witchy heritage, the advent of the television show Bewitched opened the door for the city to embrace their dark past. Today, Danvers boasts a year-round Halloween vibe and museums, ghost stories, and kitschy tourist traps to match. I, for one, am desperate to visit. Thanks for hanging out with me. This week's episode had me going into the archives of both the historical records and my own brain. I was obsessed, and I mean obsessed, with the Salem witch trials when I was a preteen, as I'm sure many of you were. I hope you learned some new things, or at least tapped into your own true crime nostalgia. This week, in honor of the month of the macabre, we have 3 additional short witch stories on TikTok, including the first witch tried and convicted in Scotland. Next week, we're headed straight to outer space for a radio program, War of the Worlds, that aired in October of 1938 and caused a national panic. Or did it? Check out social media for a video on how to make our out-of-the-world Margarita for next week, and make sure to check the description box for the ingredients needed. For next week, you'll need that good old blue curacao and some melon liqueur. I'll see you next week, and remember, there are always alternatives to murdering your witchy neighbors.